From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The great question of the 70s is, shall we surrender to our surroundings, or shall we make our peace with nature and begin to make reparations for the damage we have done to our air, to our land, and to our water?
45 years after President Richard Nixon signed the Endangered Species Act, the landmark legislation is under unprecedented attack by the Trump administration and industry lobbyists. We'll speak with the head of the Center for Biological Diversity, which has sued the Trump administration 68 times over its environmental and conservation policies. Then, as temperature records are being broken across the world, a new medical study on climate change warns up to 26,000 more people could die by suicide in the United States by 2050 if humans do not reduce emissions of greenhouse gas pollution. Plus, we look at how Central American activists are organizing against President Trump's border policies. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Pakistan, millions of people are heading to the polls today for parliamentary elections. At least 31 people were killed in an ISIS bombing at a polling station in the western city of Quetta, while other attacks on polling stations have left at least 2 people dead. The run-up to today's election has been marred by violence, including a massive suicide bombing claimed by ISIS at an election campaign gathering in the southwestern province of Baluchistan that killed over 150 people earlier this month. It was the third worst attack in Pakistan's history. Hundreds of thousands of police and soldiers have been deployed across Pakistan for today's vote, which pits former cricket star Imran Khan against the party of former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. He and his daughter were just jailed returning to Pakistan. To see our full coverage of Pakistan's general election, go to democracynow.org. CNN has published an audio tape of President Trump speaking with his longtime lawyer, his personal fixer, Michael Cohen, about how they would suppress the story of Karen McDougal, a former Playboy model who alleges she had an almost year-long extramarital affair with Trump back in 2006. The audio appears to provide evidence Trump knew about the plan to buy the exclusive rights to McDougal's story at the time. In the audio, Cohen tells Trump about his plan to set up a company and finance the purchase of the story's rights from American media, which publishes the National Enquirer. This audio, which is a little difficult to hear, begins with Cohen saying, "I need to open up a company for the transfer of all that info regarding our friend David," a reference to David Pecker, head of American media, who's a close friend of Trump's.
I need to open up a company for the transfer of all of that info regarding our friend David. When it comes time for the financing, which will be...
Listen, what financing?
We'll have to pay you. So
don't pay with cash.
No, I got it.
That was Michael Cohen saying, no, I got it, after Trump says, pay with cash. The exact meaning of Trump's words are in dispute, and Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, said Tuesday night, there's no indication of any crime being committed on this tape, unquote. The White House is also coming under fire for editing the video and written transcript of President Trump's summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Helsinki. The transcript was edited to remove part of Reuters reporter Jeff Mason's question about whether Putin wanted Trump to win the U.S. election. This is a clip of the original and then edited videos broadcast on The Rachel Maddow Show.
Options abound, and they all can be found in an
President
appropriate
Putin, did you want President
framework.
Trump to win the election, and did you direct any of your officials to help him do that?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
That's the real one. Now watch what the White House has posted online instead.
Options abound, and they all can be found in an appropriate legal framework.
And did you direct any of your officials to help him do that?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
Russia's English language transcript omits the Reuters reporter's question entirely. President Trump has announced up to $12 billion in emergency relief for farmers whose sales have been hurt by the Trump administration's escalating trade war. The Agriculture Department said it will use an existing program to provide billions of dollars in direct payments to farmers and ranchers as a short-term solution. President Trump's daughter and senior White House advisor Ivanka Trump is shutting down her namesake fashion brand amidst widespread accusations about conflicts of interest and investigations into the working conditions in her company's factories. A Guardian investigation revealed workplace abuse, grueling production targets, deplorably low pay at an Indonesian factory that makes clothing for Ivanka Trump's label. Many of the female workers at the factory in West Java said the pay is so low they live in constant debt and can't afford to live with their own children. Israel shot down a Syrian jet Tuesday it claimed had entered Israeli airspace, increasing concerns about an escalation of confrontations in the region. The Syrian government says the jet was in Syrian airspace. And more news on Syria. A suicide bombing in the southwestern city Sueda has killed at least 38 people, with dozens more wounded. The bombing in the government-held city has been blamed on ISIS. In Laos, at least 26 people have been killed, thousands more in need of rescue after a billion-dollar hydroelectric dam collapsed, flooding nearby villages and farmland. The anti-dam group International Rivers said the dam overflowed as a result of heavy monsoon rains and that climate change is exacerbating the risks to people who live downstream of dams. The collapsed dam is one of dozens of hydroelectric projects that have been proposed or are currently under construction in Laos. Meanwhile, in more climate change news, the death toll from the uncontrollable wildfires raging around the Greek capital Athens has risen to 76. Nearly 200 more people are injured, including children, by the fast-moving blazes. We'll have more on climate change later in the broadcast. In India, a nationwide trucker strike has entered its sixth day, with drivers demanding lower fuel prices and more transparency to the highway toll system. The strike has disrupted the transportation of goods nationwide, including for Amazon and other international retailers. Back in the United States, Georgia's Secretary of State Brian Kemp has won the Republican gubernatorial primary. Kemp was backed by President Trump. He'll now face Democratic progressive Stacey Abrams, who's vying to be the first African-American governor in the Deep South since Reconstruction in the November general election. And African-American activist Lucy McBath has won her congressional primary race to represent Atlanta's northern suburbs. Her son Jordan Davis was shot and killed in 2012 by a white man who shot into a car of African-American teenagers because they were playing loud music. McBath ran on a platform of tighter gun control. And the New York City delivery man who was detained by ICE after being stopped at the Fort Hamilton Army base while delivering a pizza last month has been released from detention. Emotional video footage of his reunion with his family shows Pablo Villavicencio hugging his wife and young daughters late Tuesday night after a judge ordered his release. The judge, Paul Crotty, also slammed government lawyers during a hearing, asking, quote, "Is there any concept of justice here? What is the danger to the community for a man who has committed no crime?" the judge asked. Judge Crotty was appointed by former President George W. Bush. He formerly served as corporation counsel for New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, now President Trump's lawyer. In more immigration news, a group of asylum seekers have sued ICE, accusing guards of violently repressing a peaceful hunger strike outside Adelanto detention facility in California last year, which the asylum seekers had launched to protest the lack of clean drinking water and the spoiled food and unsanitary clothes provided inside the facility. The Honduran and Salvadoran asylum seekers say the guards attacked them and placed them in isolation for organizing the hunger strike. This is plaintiff Josue Mateo Lemus Campos.
Me bañaron de gas pimienta.
They sprayed me with pepper spray. They roughed me up. They hit me in my kidneys. They grabbed my arm. Also, when there wasn't any pepper spray, they made us shower in hot water, which caused unbearable pain. The other thing was being locked up for too long. It causes stress, and it makes one want to throw in the towel. It makes you feel bad emotionally.
The Adelanto detention facility in California is operated by the for-profit company Geo Group. And in more immigration news, tomorrow is the court-imposed deadline for the Trump administration to reunite all parents and children separated by immigration officials at the border. The administration says just over 1,000 parents have been reunited with their children so far. Less than half of the families it must reunify by tomorrow, July 26th. In Oakland, California, a 27-year-old white man has been arrested for attacking two young African-American women on a BART train, killing 18-year-old Nia Wilson and wounding her sister, Latifah. The stabbing attack sparked widespread outrage in Oakland, where hundreds of people marched through the streets Monday night to demand justice for Nia. Many Oakland residents have denounced the attack as a hate crime. Authorities say they've not yet connected the suspect, John Lee Cowell, with any white supremacist groups. And in Sweden, a student activist halted an Afghan asylum seeker's deportation back to Afghanistan by refusing to sit down on a flight, preventing the plane from taking off. This is student Elin Erson, who live-streamed her direct action on the flight.
I'm not going to sit down until this person is off the plane, because he will most likely get killed if he is on this plane when it's...
After she refused to sit down, the Afghan asylum seeker was finally removed from the plane. He's now reportedly back in Swedish custody. The video of her protest has since gone viral. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. The Trump administration has announced plans to gut the Endangered Species Act, ordering federal agencies to consider economic impacts before listing animals to be protected under the law. The newly proposed guidelines by the Interior Department would allow corporations involved in mining, drilling, or other forms of extraction to proceed with projects that would otherwise be prohibited. Republican President Richard Nixon signed the Endangered Species Act in 1973 to provide a framework to conserve and protect endangered and threatened species and their habitats. The Trump administration's proposed rules are among several recent efforts to weaken the Endangered Species Act. Earlier this month, the Congressional Western Caucus introduced a package of 9 bills to, quote, modernize the ESA. In introducing the legislation, Republican Congressman Don Young of Alaska said, quote, the Endangered Species Act has been weaponized and misused by environmental groups for too long. Meanwhile, in the Senate, Wyoming Republican John Barrasso, chairman of the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, also introduced a draft bill to amend the act. This is Barrasso speaking at a hearing last week.
Congress last reauthorized the Endangered Species Act with amendments of substance in 1988, 30 years ago. Even the U.S. Constitution has been amended more recently than the Endangered Species Act. Stakeholders are making it clear that the Endangered Species Act can be improved. A major goal of the Endangered Species Act is the recovery of species to the point that protection under the statute is no longer necessary. Since the ESA was signed into law, only 54 out of 2,393 species listed in the U.S. and foreign countries have been delisted because they have recovered. That's less than 3%. Now, as a doctor, if I admit 100 patients to the hospital and only 3 recover enough under my treatment to be discharged, Governor, I would deserve to lose my medical license with numbers like that.
House Democrats, along with conservationists, managed to get excluded from Congress's annual defense spending bill policies that would restrict Endangered Species Act protections for certain animals. For more, we're joined by Kieran Suckling. He is executive director, founder of the Center for Biological Diversity, the group that has sued the Trump administration 81 times over the past year and a half. Karen, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about what is happening to the Endangered Species Act 45 years after it was passed and President Nixon signed off on it.
Yeah, the Trump administration's proposal to gut the Endangered Species Act is the most comprehensive, devastating attempt to destroy this law we've seen in this entire time. And this is after Reagan and after the Bushes. It's even worse than that. It's quite extraordinary.
Well, and specifically, how would the weakening or gutting of the act work if it went through?
Well, it will strip protection entirely for about 60% of all species on the list. And these are the species that are listed as threatened rather than endangered. Currently, they get essentially the same protection as endangered species. Under the Trump proposal, they would get no protection at all. You could continue to kill them. You could continue to destroy their habitat as if they were simply not protected.
And how would this issue of taking into account economic impacts work?
Yeah, this is really disastrous. The Endangered Species Act is incredibly successful because it requires that all decisions be made solely on the best available science. No politics, no economic concerns. So the Trump administration now wants to say, when deciding whether a species is endangered, a scientific question, you're going to have to take into account economic impacts. Well, economic activity, mining, logging, grazing, is the cause of endangerment. And this is the Endangered Species Act, not the Endangered Mining Industry Act. So it really turns the priority of this very successful law entirely upside down.
I want to turn to Richard Nixon speaking in 1970 when he outlined a sweeping plan to protect the environment. 3 years later, he signed the Endangered Species Act.
The great question of the 70s is, shall we surrender to our surroundings, or shall we make our peace with nature and begin to make reparations for the damage we have done to our air, to our land, and to our water?
So that's Richard Nixon speaking back in the 1970s. I want to go back to Republican Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming, speaking at a hearing for a draft bill to amend the Endangered Species Act.
The discussion draft elevates the role of states in partnering with the federal government to implement the Endangered Species Act. It affords states the opportunity to lead wildlife conservation efforts, including through the establishment of recovery teams for listed species and developing and implementing recovery plans. It provides for increased regulatory certainty, so stakeholders are incentivized to enter into voluntary conservation and recovery activities. It increases transparency. It codifies a system for prioritizing species listing petitions, so limited resources flow to the species most in need.
Kieran Zuckling, if you can respond to what Republican Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming was saying.
Yeah, this is really extraordinary because to get on to the endangered species list, there first has to be a finding that state plans have not worked, that state plans have caused the species to be imperiled. And so now Barrasso wants to have the law say, oh, well, let's put the states whose plans failed in charge of conserving the species. How can that make any sense at all? He wants to do that because he knows the states don't have the money, the infrastructure, and in places like Idaho, Utah, Alaska, they don't have the desire to protect these species. It's the reason they're endangered in the first place, right? We don't turn over implementation of our laws to criminals who've just been found guilty of breaking the law. The state can be a partner of the federal government. The federal government needs to set the standards, provide the funds to get the job done that the states fail to do.
And Kieran Zuckling, what's your sense of why the Trump administration is making this such a priority? I mean, President Trump is not exactly known as a guy who has a lot of concern about what's going on with nature or with the open spaces of America. He's a real estate developer. So why do you think he has moved so aggressively on this front?
Well, he's being strongly influenced by right-wing Republican congressmen, but especially those from the western states where so much logging, mining, grazing, oil drilling, coal mining is taking place on public lands. And there's this right-wing agenda to allow our public lands to be turned over to industry groups. And these folks, particularly out of Utah, have Trump's ear, and he's doing essentially whatever they want to happen.
Can you talk about, Kieran, what animals have been saved by the Endangered Species Act?
Oh, you know, there are hundreds of the 1,600 species on the domestic list. About 85% of them have improved in their population size since going on the list. So, for example, the bald eagle, when it was first put on the endangered species list, there were just a couple hundred of them. And by the time they were recovered, there were over 8,000. Other species that have been helped are the wolverine up in the northern states. The grizzly bear has recovered tremendously from on the verge of extinction to many hundreds of them. On the East Coast, we've got the Atlantic sturgeon off the coast of New York, or down in Florida, we've got the manatee, another incredible success story, green sea turtles on the Texas coast. Really, in every single state in the country, endangered species are thriving because of the work of the federal government, because of the very protections the Trump administration and Brazos want to kill.
And we've talked about what President Trump is directly trying to do. What is Barrasso in Congress? What are these efforts to amend or modernize the act about?
Yeah, so congressional Republicans have introduced over 60 bills in the last 2 years to gut the Endangered Species Act. And they know what they're doing, so these bills go right at the key decision junctures in the act that protect species, and in doing so, slow down some industries. And so they want to make it harder to put a species on the endangered species list at all, because if you stop that key moment, none of the other things flow from it. They want to allow protected habitat areas to be destroyed, even though they were set up simply to save the species. They want to change the people who create recovery plans for the species, the blueprint of what actions are needed, so that the states and industry groups dominate those plans. They want to make it so that greenhouse gas emissions and global warming cannot be addressed at all, even though they're driving almost all the species on the list extinct. They want to create loopholes so that oil companies, mining companies, logging companies can continue to implement destructive plans, even though those plans have been specifically found to be driving species extinct.
Well, you mentioned greenhouse gas emissions, but the Trump administration is also seeking to revoke California's authority to set its own tougher automobile emission standards. On Tuesday, acting EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler said the U.S. needs a single standard for fuel efficiency for cars and trucks.
Yeah, this is really outrageous because the way our Clean Air Act worked is it allows states to set standards if they're higher than the federal government. And so for 48 years running now, California has had a higher standard. It's had that through administrations, Democratic and Republican, conservative and liberal. No one's had a problem with it until Trump. And so partly this is his efforts to reduce any attempt to control global warming, but it's also clearly a personal agenda to attack California, which he believes is just generally a hostile element to him personally. And so consequently, we have this incredible irrational act, especially when, for example, we got Barrasso talking about states' rights. Let's empower the states. Well, these Republicans only want to empower the states when the states have a lower protective standard. The second a state has a higher standard, all of a sudden all concerns about state rights go out the window, and we have to go to a federal single authority that's going to reduce environmental protection.
Karen, what about the record of the Interior Secretary, Ryan Zinke? You have Think Progress saying documents released by the Department of Interior, then retracted a day later, reveal the agency officials dismissed evidence that public lands provide numerous benefits in favor of prioritizing fossil fuel interests along with ranching and logging. And then CNN reporting Zinke is meeting with people that are not on the public record. For example, met with Congressman Chris Collins, a New York Republican, who was the first in Congress to endorse Trump's presidential candidacy. That was according to the official calendar. But Zinke's calendar didn't show who else was in the room. 3 representatives of a company that do business with the National Park Service, one of about a dozen instances uncovered by CNN of Zinke's calendar omitting who he's actually meeting with.
Yeah, Zinke, I think, is going to go down as one of the worst interior secretaries in history, and his actions are very, very similar to what Scott Pruitt was doing over at EPA before he was forced to resign. And that is that he's aggressively trying to avoid all environmental laws. He's meeting with industry groups constantly and then hiding that rather than simply admitting to what he's doing in public. And the agenda is always the same. You know, what can he do to allow public lands to be destroyed? What can he do to allow more oil and gas drilling, even if it's polluting local communities, poisoning children? It's really a disaster. He's turned this agency, which is supposed to be in charge of America's land, air, water, and species, into a handout program for industry, and then going so far as just erase all this from his calendar, from his meeting notes, to take decisions from lower officials who are trying to do their job and erase all references to issues which harms their agenda. And in particular, what you'll see is that protecting public lands, especially on national monuments, is really good for local economies. But instead, they'll erase all that information and say, oh, this is hurting local economies. And it's not just immoral, it's illegal. And it's the reason why this agency gets sued so much.
And staying on the Interior Department and Zinke, the department has also commissioned an expedited environmental review of the impact of leasing part of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Now, this is a decades-long battle that the industry, the oil and gas industry, has not been able to win. What is happening here, and what could be the potential impact of this new expedited review?
Yeah, this is very concerning. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge off the coast of Alaska has been sought after by the oil industry for many, many decades now, and has always been stopped because it's such a crown jewel of environmental protection. There's so many other areas available for drilling. So Zinke now has expedited efforts to review proposed drilling up there, brought on millions of dollars of new money, which apparently don't exist to do anything else in government, more staff, and he wants to push through at a very rapid clip a decision to open this up to more drilling. And he's throwing all the environmental standards review processes out the window. And I think it's partly because he knows time is limited up there for him. And he wants this to become his legacy, the guy who opened up America's biggest, most important wildlife refuge to oil drilling.
Kieran Suckling, we're speaking to you in Portland, Oregon. In Yosemite right now, the national park, thousands of people are being evacuated because of terrible wildfires. I want to ask you about something else that happened in Oregon. Earlier this month, Donald Trump pardoned Dwight Hammond and his son Stephen Hammond, two Oregon cattle ranchers who were convicted in 2012 of committing arson on federal lands. Prosecutors say the Hammonds set the fires to cover up their illegal deer poaching. Their conviction sparked armed right-wing militiamen, led by Ammon Bundy, to take over the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon, provoking a 41-day armed standoff in 2016. Can you comment on this and what message President Trump was sending with these pardons?
This is very disturbing because the Hammonds not only were arsonists who set fire to our public lands, threatening firefighters who were out there, but have a long history of threatening to kill federal officials. And when the Bundy militia group came up to support them when they were prosecuted, they came up there with the message of not just let's help the Hammonds, but let's give all of America's public lands away to industry and state groups. And so when Trump is pardoning these people, he's really sending a signal to this right-wing base to say, hey, anti-government extremism, threats of violence against those you don't like, against the government, are acceptable. They're encouraged. And in fact, earlier, when he pardoned Joe Arpaio, another very controversial action, well, it turns out Joe Arpaio, Sheriff Joe, was also a supporter of this Bundy group and this radical, violent agenda. And I think it goes along with Trump gearing up this violent undercurrent in America to support him and to drive fear into others.
Last week, Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh submitted to the Senate his responses to a lengthy questionnaire as part of the confirmation process. In responding to a question about the 10 most significant cases over which he sat, Kavanaugh cited his dissenting opinion in White Stallion Energy Center v. EPA, in which he argued that the EPA must consider financial costs when deciding whether to regulate emissions from power plants. Kavanaugh wrote in the questionnaire, quote, "In my view, it was unreasonable and therefore unlawful under the Administrative Procedure Act for EPA not to consider the costs imposed by regulations and determining whether such regulations were appropriate and necessary." I'm wondering your thoughts on if Judge Kavanaugh is confirmed for the Supreme Court, what the impact of this would be on environmental laws in the future.
Well, it would be extraordinary. I mean, Trump has already had one appointee on the Supreme Court. If he gets the second, he will likely be able to control the whole judicial agenda for environmental protection in this country. And that's incredibly important because right now, the strongest, most powerful force of resistance against Trump is our legal system. And that's because virtually everything he wants to do is illegal. The people he's put in place, like Zinke and Pruitt, to carry out his agenda, have such disdain for governance. They don't even know how to do governmental process properly. So they're continually sued. They're continually found guilty. And that's keeping America on track, this independent judiciary. So if Trump captures the Supreme Court, we're going to find he's got an open agenda to do whatever he wants. And so it's very, very dangerous and disheartening.
We just have a few seconds, but Kieran Suckling, your organization, the Center for Biological Diversity, has sued the Trump administration 81 times in this last year and a half. Have you had any success?
Yeah, we've actually won most of those cases. It's been about one a week. And of those that have completed, we've won most of those cases. And it just shows you the power of our independent legal system and our independent judiciary to address excesses of power, even by the President of the United States.
Well, Kieran Suckling, we thank you so much for being with us from Portland, Oregon, Executive Director and founder of the Center for Biological Diversity. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, thank you. When we come back, as records are broken, heat records around the country and around the world, we'll look at a new medical study that indicates suicide will go up by tens of thousands as a result of climate change. Stay with us.
Jungle was your playground and the forest was your home, and the meadows and the mountains were where you loved to roam. If you woke up in the morning and all of this were gone, how would you feel? If your friends were all around you and your neighbors were there too, every member of your family was living close to you. If you woke up in the morning all alone and in a zoo, how would you feel? How would you feel? Danger, danger, animals in danger from the big to the small. And we stand or fall together, 'cause this world needs us all.
Animals in Danger by Johnny and the Raindrops. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to look at climate change and its impact on human lives. Greece has declared 3 days of mourning over its worst wildfire since 2007 that have killed at least 60 people in towns near Athens, including families with children who were found clasped in a last embrace as they tried to flee the flames. Greece and other European nations have been facing record heat and an unusually dry summer. This is Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras.
There are no words to describe our feelings in times like this. The country is experiencing an unspeakable tragedy. Dozens of human lives are gone, and this is unbearable for everyone, and most of all for the families who lost their loved ones.
This comes as Japan has declared its deadly heat wave a natural disaster. At least 80 people have died from the heat in Japan, and the death toll is expected to continue to rise. In Africa, temperatures reached a staggering 124 degrees Fahrenheit earlier this month in Algeria. It was the highest recorded temperature ever in Africa. Meanwhile, here in the United States, a staggering 41 different heat records have been broken so far this month. In California, wildfires have forced the closure of Yosemite National Park, forcing the evacuation of thousands of people.
Well, on Monday, a new study published in the journal Nature Climate Change reported that when there are abnormally hot temperatures, there also tend to be higher suicide rates. The study predicts suicide rates in the United States and Mexico could actually rise with each 1 degree Celsius increase in a month's average temperature. For more, we're going to San Francisco, where we're joined by Dr. Sanjay Basu, co-author of the new study, Higher Temperatures Increase Suicide Rates in the United States and Mexico. Dr. Basu is an assistant professor of medicine at Stanford University and co-author of the book, The Body Economic: Why Austerity Kills. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Dr. Basu. Talk about this new study.
Well, thank you for having me. The new study tries to explain a statistical phenomenon that has been observed since the early 19th century, which is what seems to be the relationship between temperature and suicide. And importantly, this study tries to disentangle a mere correlation from a more causal relationship using new statistical methods. So the study examined counties in the U.S. and Mexico from as far back as the 1960s, and after correcting for seasonality, economic changes, and a wide range of other factors, we observed a direct relationship between increased average temperatures and suicides, replicating the effects observed since the 19th century of heat waves and unusual heat waves and excess suicides, particularly among older adults.
Now, could you, obviously there might be some skeptics who would say, well, a correlation is not a cause and effect. And how do you respond to those concerns?
We did a number of new statistical techniques to decipher the two. One of the most important is that we looked within the same area over time and looked at comparing unusual heat waves that are attributable to climate change to the typical range of heat, and then correcting for all other factors that might affect suicide rates within the area. We also controlled for a number of other variables and looked at larger data sets than ever studied before and confirmed the findings in a wide range of other data sources. For example, we looked at over 600 million geocoded Twitter accounts where people publicly posted depressive or suicidal thoughts. We also compared that to national mortality linkages and deciphered some of the mechanisms that might explain this temperature-suicide relationship.
And you found a 1 degree Celsius increase in average monthly temperature correlates with increases in the monthly suicide rate in the United States and in Mexico. Talk about the differences you found in our two countries.
One of the key issues between the two countries is not only the higher average temperature in Mexico, but also some differences in the economics of the countries and in the typical work that people have in the countries. There have been prior studies that examined how people in different job sectors and at different income levels are affected by temperature increases due to climate change. In our case, we actually found remarkably consistent increases in the risk of suicide across a number of sectors, rather than simply isolated to, for example, people in the agricultural sector.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because one would think that the impact of climate change, especially economically, would be felt even much more so in people in the countryside rather than the cities. But you didn't see any distinct or qualitative difference between the impact for rural areas versus urban areas?
Yeah, it was rather remarkable. Over time, it appears that although in earlier years of climate change, rural areas are disproportionately affected, and we do still see, for example, the relationship between a bad harvest year and increased suicides. As time has progressed, and as both urban and rural populations are affected by climate change, we actually see the beginning of consistency across all groups, such that individuals across a number of employment sectors and locations appear to be almost equally affected now.
You also examined whether monthly temperature also correlates with patterns of depressive posts on social media containing certain keywords like depressed, lonely, suicidal. Talk more about that, so we're not just talking suicide here.
And also, are you sure that it's not that people get more depressed the more they use social media?
That may be a separate phenomenon. But we also looked at correcting over time for trends in social media use and how much people use these words within locations, just as a temporal trend, as a routine trend over time, versus their use of these words, in particular words that have in previous studies related to their suicide risk, in unusually warm months within the same location versus normal months within the same location, and even for the same person. That helps us to try to statistically isolate the relationships of temperature, and we add some additional controls looking at factors like employment. So there may be separate relationships, and certainly there's multiple factors relating to mental health. We try to disentangle that portion that seems to relate in particular to increasing temperatures.
You also co-wrote a new study on the impact of climate change on the world's food supply. What did you find there? And also, is there a link to farmer suicides in India?
Certainly the issue of farmer suicides in India has been appropriately brought to light over the last few years as suicide rates seem to increase in times of economic devastation, and particularly devastation after inclement climate events. But we seem to find that there's a second phenomenon that's been less discussed. As carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere, the nutritional quality of staple crops appears to decrease remarkably. The vitamin and mineral content of key crops that are the major staples for particularly low and middle income countries decreases in nutrient quality for important nutrients like iron and zinc. And we find, in fact, that the rates of nutrient deficiency that can lead to important diseases are expected to increase dramatically in the context of climate change.
Dr. Sanjay Basu, we want to thank you for being with us, Assistant Professor of Medicine at Stanford University, co-author of the new study, Higher Temperatures Increase Suicide Rates in the United States and Mexico, co-author of the book, The Body Economic, Why Austerity Kills. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, how Central American activists here in this country are organizing against President Trump's immigration policies. Stay with us.
The cry is out. The earth is getting hotter without a doubt. The glaciers are melting in the north and south. Our lives are about to change. There is only one way to survive this. You got to purify your body, get rid of toxins. Pray unto the Father who lives within. The ego you have to tame. Survival is definitely for the fittest. It's not for who get the money or the fame the quickest. Just according to your actions and the way you live it. That is how the Most High I go give it. The sea level is rising, watch the table a turn. Plus the ring of fire around the coastal regions will burn. Check the kind of food you eat and type of drinks you consume. Listen up to the lyrics in the tune. Microorganisms are getting replaced. From the mountain to the sea, it is a different age. It's a time of revelation prophesied by the sage. The Jah is the reason why you were made. The heat beneath the ocean, it'll bring a hurricane. Attitude inside the people.
Globe All Warming by Nayora here on Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, we end today's show with a leading Central American activist's response to the crisis prompting thousands in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala to seek asylum in the United States. This week, the Trump administration announced it may have deported up to, or actually disclosed, it may have deported up to 463 parents of children separated by immigration officials at the border, even as their children remain in U.S. custody. This comes as a federal judge has ordered the Trump administration to reunite all separated migrant children and parents by Thursday, July 26th. But the administration says just over 1,000 parents have been reunited with their children so far. Less than half of the families it must reunite by tomorrow. Earlier this month, President Trump pushed back against a court ruling mandating the reunification of families.
Well, I have a solution. Tell people not to come to our country illegally. That's the solution. Don't come to our country illegally. Come like other people do. Come legally.
This comes as a federal judge in Boston ruled Monday a lawsuit can proceed in court that argues the Trump administration's end to temporary protected status for immigrants in the United States from Honduras, Haiti, El Salvador was racially motivated. About 400,000 immigrants stand to lose their TPS, their temporary protected status, including more than 260,000 from El Salvador, nearly 60,000 people from Haiti, and 86,000 from Honduras. For more, we go to Chicago, where we're joined by Oscar Chacon, Executive Director of Alianza Americas, the Alliance of the Americas, a network of Latin American immigrant-led organizations committed to advancing a public policy agenda to improving life in their communities in the U.S. and their countries of origin. His most recent essay for Medium is headlined, Why Abolish ICE Doesn't Go Far Enough for Migrant Families. So here we are. It's Wednesday, Oscar. Tomorrow is the deadline imposed by a federal judge in San Diego. The federal government is saying that they've reunited 1,000 families. That's not even half of the kids that they ripped away from their parents at the border. The deadline's tomorrow. Can you talk about the effect of this, how you're organizing?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the explanation to the fact that so few parents have actually been reunited with their kids is because the administration felt so incredibly confident that nobody was going to challenge these particular actions and that they will never have to face, the challenge of actually reuniting parents and children. What we are essentially saying is this particular episode that we've seen unfolding over the past several weeks is actually perhaps a preview of what we are likely to see over the next year or so, simply because as the termination of temporary protected status, DACA, and other forms of remedies that are often protecting people like the Central American immigrant community come to an end, there will be far, far more children potentially separated from their kids. Take into account that just in terms of TPS recipients, there are nearly 250,000 U.S.-born children whose parents are only TPS recipients. And if they were to be first taken away of this particular protection and then placed in potential deportation proceedings, put perhaps in detention and eventually deported, we may see a far larger challenge in as far as the images that we saw in the U.S. southern border recently. So clearly to us, this is a situation where we need to go much deeper than we've gone so far. We believe it is important for Americans to understand that what's been happening in the border has been happening for years and will likely happen even more so in the future. So we need to absolutely ramp up the efforts to ensure that people understand that this is a tragedy that has been long in the making and that has its foundations in laws that were actually passed long ago, 1996 to be more precise. And unless we manage to gradually change these particular laws, we will continue to see these heartbreaking images of families being broken apart.
Well, Oscar, I wanted to ask you that about the roots of this problem, because we've been hearing a lot lately, certainly in the progressive community, about the call to abolish ICE.
I'm not listening anything.
But most Americans do not realize that ICE was only created in 1996 as a result of the law you mentioned, the Immigration and Reform Act of 1996 that was signed into law by President Clinton. I'm wondering if you could talk about how that law really set the stage for what happened not only under President Obama, but especially now under President Trump. I think we're having a little problem with Oscar hearing us. Can you hear us, Oscar?
Yes, I believe I can hear you now.
Okay.
For a minute I was out.
Well, let me repeat that there's been a lot of calls recently for the abolition of ICE, but most Americans are not aware that ICE is a relatively new agency in government affairs. It came out of the 1996 Act that you alluded to, the Immigration and Reform Act. I'm wondering if you could talk more about how that act, signed by President Clinton, set the stage for these mass deportations that occurred both under President Obama and now especially ramped up under President Trump. What was it about that law that made what's happening now possible?
Well, let me begin by saying that the 1996 Immigration Act was actually the evolution of a movement that actually originated much earlier and that first came into national awareness in 1994 in the context of a gubernatorial race in California. You may recall that California voters actually adopted Proposition 187, which was a very rudimentary anti-immigrant ballot initiative in California, and it passed. Many people thought that the fact that the Supreme Court stopped most of Proposition 187 from ever going into effect was the end of the story, but in reality was only the launching moment for what became federal policy in 1996. At the heart of the 1996 immigration policy reform was a belief that painted all immigrants, but particularly Mexican and Latin American immigrants, as some sort of threat to the country. That particular threat was, again, enshrined essentially into this particular immigration law that is driven by three critical principles: exclusion, restriction, and punishment. And what they really wanted to do with this particular act was to stop people that many racist, white supremacist forces consider to be undesirable as residents of the U.S., but also wanted to kick out of the country as many people as possible also deemed as undesirable. So what we have had in the books since 1996 has been a horrible piece of law that actually makes possible everything that we have seen from that point forward. The events of 9/11 in 2001 only bolstered even more this basic architecture of foreigners and immigrants as threats to the country. And as you pointed out, ICE is a relatively new agency. The problem is not necessarily an enforcement agency, because when you have good laws in place, it is important to indeed enforce the laws. The problem we have essentially is that whether it is ICE or whether it is the Border Patrol, the bottom line is the law that they are charged with enforcing is a horrible piece of legislation that, frankly, unless we manage to gradually chip away, destroy it, abolish it, we will continue to face the same horrifying images that we have seen at the border and that we see on a daily basis whenever ICE carries out raids against people who are hardworking, tax-paying contributors to the United States of America.
Can you talk about the sanctuary movement today around the country, where particularly women, Central American women, are taking refuge in churches, communities protecting them, and how it compares to what happened in the 1980s, the sanctuary movement here in the United States, with the U.S. backing of the right-wing regimes, terribly murderous regimes in Guatemala, in Honduras, and El Salvador?
Well, first of all, let me say that as someone who came to the U.S. Still in my teenage years in 1980 and who became involved in what was broadly known as the Solidarity Movement back in the 1980s, I actually had a very close relationship with the sanctuary movement back then. I believe it was a practical statement of disagreement by people of faith in this country to policies that were being enacted by the federal government precisely against Central American immigrants running away mostly from dictatorial right-wing regimes in Central America. What I see today, indeed, there is a so-called new sanctuary movement, is a gradual expression again of dissenting voices, mainly from faith communities that are appalled at the policies that we continue to have in place, that we continue to enforce. And I believe that sanctuary movement, whether it is in the form of places of worship or actually cities declaring themselves sanctuary, are once again expressions, very important expressions of a dissenting voice that is trying to once again point out that these actions are far from what most Americans would consider morally acceptable. And I believe they will play a very important role in gradually reversing the policies and the actions that follow the policies that make so many people ashamed of our government and ashamed of the actions that have been taking place more recently at the U.S. southern border. But I emphasize these actions take place in many cities throughout the country because of enforcement agencies like ICE implementing a horrible law like the one we passed in 1996.
And finally, we only have about 45 seconds, but if you could comment on how the change of government in Mexico may have an impact or from your perspective on the continuing crisis at the border between the U.S. and Mexico?
Well, I mean, we are hopeful that the new administration will actually take a deep look at the policies that have been in effect over the past several years. I'd like to point out that following the so-called humanitarian crisis declared by President Obama in 2014, the Mexican government, for all practical purposes, became the extended border for the U.S. And we've seen a huge increase in the deportations from Mexico, essentially replicating the deportation practices that the U.S. had been engaged in. So we are hopeful that the new administration will again take a fresh look at this and reassess whether this is the right policy for Mexico, a nation that prides itself from saying that it is an international human rights leader. We just don't see that in practice, but we love to see that come to be the case with the new administration.
Oscar Chacon, we want to thank you for being with us, Executive Director of Alianza Americas. His recent essay, we'll link to it, Medium, Why Abolish ICE Doesn't Go Far Enough for Migrant Families. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Has a job opening for a broadcast engineer here in New York City. Find out more at democracynow.org. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gaddis, Dina Sam Alkoff. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.